So, with the beginning of Advent season, we're talking about the expectations of Jesus, of watching Jesus coming into our life. And that takes many forms and looks different in a lot of different ways. But one thing we're going to talk about this morning is hope, a godly hope that we can look forward to. And so we're going to start by reading a small passage out of Exodus and then tell a little bit about our story and how we have hopeful expectations. So in Exodus chapter 15, there's the story of Moses and the Israelites. They've just crossed the Red Sea, and it says in verse 22, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur.
For 3 days they traveled in the desert without
finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water
because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?"
Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood.
He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made a decree and a law
for them, and there he tested them. He said, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees,
I will not bring you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you."
Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a second. But first, I just want to share with you a little bit about how that's looked in our lives of hope and disappointment, and God looking to God and saying, "Why are we here at this place of bitter water?" So we were in Guadalajara for 10 years, and we really loved it. We enjoyed our ministry, enjoyed where we lived, we enjoyed the people around us, and we could see, though, that we would probably be there just a few more years, that the churches were at a point where it would be more healthy for them, for the Americans to leave, and for them to just rely on Mexican leadership. And so as we were thinking about that and looking towards a transition, we were invited to move to Mexico City to work with a different type of missions. It was an organization that reached out to the poorest of the poor in the slums outside of Mexico City, and they were building a retreat site for the workers who just suffered from burnout from the high stress of that job. And we were invited to come in, help build the retreat site, work with the Christian social workers in the organization, bringing them renewal. And so that's why we made the move to this little bitty pueblo outside of Mexico City. When we went to check it out to see did we want to move there, we made a big list of all the things that we wanted to see. And so Kim and I were talking about what were we looking for on this survey trip. What did we want God to show us that would let us know that we had found the right spot? And so as we're driving, we began asking the kids, "What do you want to see? What do you want to find?" And they came up with this list that Kim and I started looking at each other like, this is crazy. I'm sorry, kids, but we can't ask God to provide a zip line. And we can't ask God to provide, and I'll let them share a few of the things that they began saying, "We want to see this, we want to see this." And so we had this huge list.
Fruit trees, running water in the property,
Bunnies,
zip line,
And climbing wall.
tree for tree house.
or sheep,
We wanted chickens that lay eggs.
the moat.
We wanted to live right next to the retreat that we were living at.
So we spent 2 days in this place, and it seemed like everything that we had asked about was there. The retreat site that they were using, that they were renting, while the new one was being built, had a zip line for kids to play on. And when we saw that, we just kind of looked at each other like, "Oh, this is weird." I can't remember all the things, but I remember chickens because the landlady who we were looking at will rent from her. As we were pulling out of her driveway, she came running after us with a tin full of eggs. She's like, "My chickens laid these this morning, and I want to give these to you, so you'll have some when you get back to Guadalajara." So there were a ton of things that we said very specifically, God, we would like to see this. And it seemed like each of those weird, crazy, specific things, God said, hey, I've got this laid out for you. And so we felt that, and who we were working with, and the vision of the ministry, we just really felt like this is where God is leading us to.
So we were in a place that we really loved, and for a lot of reasons, besides just the physical answers to that list, but just really felt like the right fit and the right place for us. And I guess, long story short on that, the cloud of God obviously moved from that place and just led us away.
So we made the decision of what we believe was the best thing for our family at the time, was to move out of there, which you can imagine when you really feel like God has led you into this place and you think this is what God has said, come do this, and you go, and once you're there you realize in the end it doesn't feel healthy. It doesn't feel like this is what we need to be doing. So we were asking God, what happened? We thought you called us specifically into this place. And so when we were asking those questions and just putting it out there, saying to God, this is really disappointing. What's happened here? Actually, Kim came across this story of the waters of Mara. And it was so interesting. It was so interesting to see that if you go back to the very end of chapter 13, when it talks about how the Israelites were led, it says in verse 21 of chapter 13,
By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way,
and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night.
neither the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people.
So then when you jump to chapter 15 and it says they're wandering looking for water, you can understand that it's the human perspective of what's going on, that they're wandering looking for water, but it's the cloud that's leading them. And it's the cloud that's guiding them to the place of water, and they get there and it's bitter. And so these nations of people, this nation of people, that fathers and moms who want to take care of their kids, and they're following the cloud, and they think you're leading us to safety and protection, and they get there and the water's horrible.
And there was a time when we already knew we were going to move, and we were very sad about it, that we have some photos of. The photos aren't that good, but the memory of it is so fantastic that I hope they make it into this story. There was a morning I wanted to tell you about when Carson and I went for a walk outside, and it was early and the sun was coming up and it was really foggy, which was strange for the area that we lived in. But the fog was kind of glowing in such an inviting way that we just went outside and hiked up this little mountainous path behind our house to a white cross, and we spent a little bit of time up there. But the reason that the walk is so vivid in my mind is that we were looking across a valley that usually you could see clearly everything that was down there. And we were looking over the fog into a mountain on the other side of the valley. And that mountain, it actually has the word promesas written on it in Spanish, which means promises. And people in Mexico would take pilgrimages up that mountain, especially if they had answered prayers from God. But it was remarkable that that mountain of promises was kind of poking up out of the fog across the valley from where we were. And so Carson and I stood on the mountaintop where we were, just watching the fog sort of cover it and then reveal the top of it again. And we were really sad about moving, but we felt like that was God's constant promises, even when they start to become sort of impaired by fog.
that that He's always with us and that He has really good things ahead. And so it's meaningful for us to remember that in a time that's still a little bit foggy in our lives, but we feel assured of God's presence with us and that His promises are firm.
And so we're at a place now where we're waiting and watching for His answer and where He wants us to be in the future. But I feel like we're encamped in the place with really fresh water and I don't know how many trees. It just feels like a really good place to be right now. So even if we're not in our promised land, I feel like God's hand is on our family and taking care of us.
So if you go back to the second half of verse 25, it says, there the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there He tested them. He said, if you listen carefully to the voice of your Lord, and He goes on that this was a challenge to find out, are you going to listen to the voice of your Lord? And it ends up, I am the Lord who heals you. So you can see that throughout history, God is leading His people, but not always into places of their expectations. But that doesn't take away from the fact that He was still leading. And the next verse says, then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water. So it's not like they got to Mara by accident. It's not like God couldn't have taken them directly to Elim and said, look, here's water. He had to take them to a place of bitterness first, because that was a part of His plan of teaching the people to rely on Him and trust His presence. So then you think, what an interesting time to have a cloud or a pillar of fire that you could just look to and know. But there were thousands of years of Israelite history where they remember these stories fondly and think, man, when God was with us. And so then we come to the foretelling of Christ and saying, and by the way, His name's going to be Emmanuel, because God is with us. And so all of these years of thinking about how wonderful it would have been to follow the cloud and follow the pillar of fire, and God to say, oh, you have no idea. It's going to be so much better, because it's not going to be a cloud or a pillar of fire. It's going to be me, represented in flesh form, the Emmanuel, the God is with you. And so we have hope that even when we don't know what this is always all about, and we don't know all the lessons yet that we're supposed to have learned from this story, but we know the I am is with us. The I am with you is with us. And so that gives us hope that there is an Elim in our journey. There's an Elim where there are palm trees and fresh water, and that brings us hope.